Welcome, everyone. We've gone live a little bit early. We'll introduce the event in just a little bit, but welcome to a dark, strange summer, June 23rd, 2022. Welcome to Nighttime Logic. I'm here with Brenda Tolian and Manuel Arenas, and we were just hey Brenda, hey Manuel, how are you two?
Hey, hot.
All right, thanks. Hi.
Good.
We'll continue talking. We were having a little journey around the world as we're waiting for everyone to come in here of talking about inspiration in places far away. But I'm coming at you from here in New York, and Manuel is coming at you from Phoenix, and Brenda's in New Orleans, and at least two out of those three places, it's hotter than hell. I'm told.
It's
I
pretty
Well,
think
at the
warm.
moment, it just started raining over here, but yeah, earlier in the day was triple digits. Yeah,
They
is that
call
going to cool
it
you down a little bit? Will that rain cool you down for a minute or two, or how long is that going to last?
we'll see. Fingers crossed. It's. I mean, over here, the especially since it became so developed with the concrete and the sidewalks and everything, it retains the heat. I mean, 9 and 10 o'clock at night, you go out, it's still hot, even though the sun has gone down. Yeah.
And is it safe? Is it safe yet to go out where you are, Brenda? I know you've got a furred friend and companion that just wants to get outside, but not yet, not safe yet.
no, it's still too warm for Basha. So we'll take a stroll after this probably. I like walking around the neighborhood in the evening anyway. It's beautiful,
Do
but it
you
is
have
Yes.
huh?
I was gonna say, do you have the like the little booties that they have for the dogs for walking on the hot sidewalks? That's a big thing out here.
Um, she probably wouldn't wear them. But that's why we wait till the sun's gone down,
Mhm.
and I do my hand test on the concrete to make sure she's not gonna get
Right.
too burnt. But it's only about 3 blocks to the park, and then the park is pretty close. And then we have other things, so you might hear, like last night there was a lion roaring really loud, and the first time she heard it, it freaked her out because she's very protective of whoever she's with. So she's looking for the danger and she couldn't figure it out. And now she's gotten used to the lions. So now she's just
What,
like, huh?
do you live near a zoo, or what? Or are there mountain lions near where you are?
No, no, it's a zoo. So it's real lions.
Okay.
And
Wow.
they're loud. You can hear them all the way over here
Oh
at my
yeah.
house. They're very
You
loud.
can hear you can hear that lion roar, and you can feel that in your chest if you're close enough. So
Oh, it's
the
kind of
three of us
glorious.
we will stay here inside, hopefully, where it is cool. But it is dark and it is strange, and we'll be staying here where we horror writers like to spend a bit of our time in safely talking about these adventures from the other side of our computer screens. So again, thank you. Thank you to everyone. I see Amelia. I see Matt in the comments. Hey, you too. Hello to everyone joining us. I'll introduce the event properly. Welcome to Nighttime Logic, a dark, strange summer. This is the first of four summer events we're going to be doing. So again, tonight is June 23rd. We're here with Manuel Arenas and Brenda Tolian. Welcome, you two. Before we get started, the rest of our series will be continuing in July, on July 21st, with Rudy Dorneman and Robert Levy. We'll be back in August, on August 26th, with Rebecca Rowland and
That's
Gwendolyn
my
Drake.
birthday.
Well, happy birthday in advance. And the summer will wrap up the summer Wednesday, September 7th, with Steve Berman and Norman Prentice. I'll introduce you to our two guests tonight. Manuel Arenas is a writer of verse and prose in the Gothic horror tradition. His work has appeared in Spectral Realms and Penumbra, both from Hippocampus Press, and in sundry genre anthologies. In 2021, he released his first collection of prose and poetry, Book of Shadows, Grim Tales, and Gothic Fancies, from Jackanapes Press. Let's see if I can get that up.
There you go.
It's a wonderful book. It's illustrated by Dan Sauer as
Sour.
well, and be sure to hold that up and show some pictures there. And he currently resides in Phoenix, Arizona, where he pens his dark ditties, sheltered behind heavy curtains, as he shuns the oppressive orb, very timely noted, which glares down on him from the cloudless, dust-filled sky. So welcome to Manuel. And I want to
Thank you.
Brenda Tolian. Welcome, Manuel. And welcome to Brenda. Brenda Tolian is the author of Blood Mountain, which was recently came out on June 8th, 2022, published by Raw Dog Screaming Press. Congratulations on the release. Let's get this up in front of the camera here. I'm not sure if I'm centering it correctly. There we
I
go.
love that cover.
And that's is that a Daniel Sarah cover?
Yeah,
Great.
the one and only.
Great job.
Yeah,
Very cool.
Yeah, it's a great looking illustration. Yeah, both very good looking books, wonderful books. Brenda is a member of the HWA, AWP, and the Angela Carter Society. Her work has appeared in 101 Proof Horror, Consumed Tales of the Wendigo, The Jewish Book of Horror, Twisted Pulp Magazine, and the HWA Poetry Showcase, Volume 8. She's also part of the trio of directors at Ouroboros, Screaming the Dark wing of Hilary Leftovich's Alchemy Writers Workshop. She also co-hosts a Burial Plot horror podcast with the author Joy Yelly. She currently she works on her doctorate and lives and explores the great city of New Orleans, and you can find her at her website, which is brendatolian.com. So welcome, Brenda. Welcome, Manuel. It's great to have you both here. Let's start. Let's go right into it. Manuel, I've got lots of questions for you, but
good.
Let's start the night off with a reading. Can you have a selection picked out for us from the Book of Shadows that you'd like to read for us?
Yeah, actually, I have my copy too. Oh, wait. I never forgot how this works. There we go. I am going to read for you the opening piece, which is from the section entitled Morbidezza. Oh, yeah, you got it as well. Morbidezza and Other Denizens of the Dark Wood. And yes, there's the glorious, there we go. Glorious illustration by Dan Sauer. If you go to the Jackanapes Press website, in the at the top, there's a banner that's constantly changing. It has artwork from the various books, and they have this picture in red, and it's amazing. It just looks, it's so in your face. It's so, well, it's appropriate anyway. And it's the sanguinary saga of Morbidezza Vespertilio Vampirus, and this is the first section. It's called Morbidezza, and without further ado, I shall read it to you. So,
all right, we'll turn it over to you, and we'll be back at the other end of your reading.
Okay, cool. And as I said, this is, I've got to figure out where the camera is on this thing. That's Morbidezza. And here we go. Immured within a tourmaline tower, the vampiress Morbidezza Vespertilio waits. Weary and wan, she gazes through the silver bars at the crimson-colored glass of the lone tower window which keeps the deleterious sunlight at bay. Combing her silken sable tresses, she broods over her dispossession and personal losses as she tries to recall the aspect of spilt blood on a moonlight kill. She is allowed one book by her captor, a Bible, which she largely ignores save for when she uses it as a source sanctorum to divine auguries of her desiderated release. To while away the endless hours of her captivity, she plays a spinet and sings a melancholy monody for her long-lost love, Corbel Graf von Tortenlaut, who's slain by Adalbert Glady, a tow-headed, prosperous blacksmith's son and self-styled vampire hunter from Leipzig. He staked the venerable count as he lay, estivate and defenseless in his coffin, then decapitated him and stuffed his mouth with garlic. However, when it came time to dispatch his Venetian consort, beauty stayed the slayer's hand. The inexpert young Adalbert was so taken by her luxuriant black hair, her exquisite pallor, and scarlet mouth, he could not bring himself to destroy her. Instead, he bound her coffin in silver chains and kept it under a haystack in his father's smithy until he could build a small tower house, with Schorl transported from the Ore mountain region in Saxony, which he furnished with some of her belongings that he seized from the vampire Schloss. He erected the structure deep in a riparian forest, far away from prying eyes, and placed its entrance on the banks of the river so that if the lady found her way out of her confinement, she could not cross the threshold. The somber tower loomed forbiddingly beneath the crown canopy of the forest like a benighted beacon, its Pisces walls barely capable of retaining the mortiferous miasma which seeped between its stones through the porous lime mortar, blighting the adjacent demesne, felling all the flora save for deadly nightshade, and repelling all the fauna save for those creatures which emerge after the vesper bells summon the faithful to eventide horizons. Most notably a cortege of bats which swarmed the structure, flying to the aid of their sovereign. To curry favor with the lady, and at considerable cost to his depleted purse, he purchased an ornate girandole mirror from her native land, replete with candlesticks to light up her gloomy little chamber. When she espied it across the room upon awakening from her diurnal repose, the lady overlaid it apace with a cramoisi mantle which suggested to him a cascade of blood. Abashed upon grasping his gaff, he left for her a turtle dove in a gilded cage as a peace offering, only to discover upon the morrow the headless, bloodless body of the little bird sprawled within the mangled cage. Conceding defeat, he swore off procuring anything else for the dark Donna that she did not herself request. Because his Lutheran sensibilities won't allow for the procuration of innocent blood for her profane sustenance, she has become etulate, torpid, and to all appearances exanimate. Yet, underneath that lifeless facade, her preternatural anatomy toils constantly to revivify her undead carcass as her demoniac mind cogitates on vendetta. Unsure of how to gauge her condition, Adalbert visits his captive daily in her solitary room and lights a spermaceti candle by her catafalque so that he may pore over her comely countenance, looking for signs of corruption whilst furtively pining for a return of her unnatural vigor. For hours he gapes at her black velvet voluptuousness and her necrophilic allure, her alabaster bosom, her pallid brow, and her mesmeric red mouth. The gelid touch of her memorial flesh causes a thrilling horripilation to surge through his peaked physique. Every day he stays longer and longer, lingering until his eyes start to grow bleary and flutter as the candle flame sputters into oblivion and a puddle of pellucid wax. And all the while Morbidezza's violet irids, ostensibly insensate, peer surreptitiously through the villous lashes of her creviced eyelids, awaiting the day when her besotted subduer tarries too long in his vigil, providing her an opportunity to exact her revenge under the sanguinary rays of the setting sun as it filters through the crimson panes of the tower window like a cataract of retributive blood.
Thank you so much. That was Morbidezza from the Book of Shadows, Grim Tales and Gothic Fancies. I had my questions in a certain order, but I have to just skip skip to the Gothic. The language is so rich and it's such a Gothic tale. So I just can't wait a second longer just to ask you about that. Ask you about um, how. Tell us a bit about your joy of the Gothic tradition in literature, and who are some of your influences and inspirations, and how did it inspire your work?
Well, I think the granddaddy of all I do is Edgar Allan Poe. Uh, my mom introduced me to Poe when I was a tween, and I uh, I ran with it. I just loved it. I started off with like uh, kind of classics illustrated type things, because I was just a kid.
Hmm.
And then slowly but surely, as I got older, I read the actual tales and got into that. And then saw the Roger Corman films of Vincent Price, and I just all ate it all up. And of course, as I get older, I understand more of the a lot of it went over my head as a kid. I just liked the spookiness of it and everything. But as I got older, I appreciated the language, um, and what he was doing, which technically speaking, he's not a Gothic writer. He uses Gothic tropes. What he was doing was something different. He was one of the first people to really get into like psychological horror and all this, and he just used uh, the tools available to him at the time, what was popular. He wrote all different kinds of
Let me
stuff.
ask you about that. I'm a real newcomer to the Gothic tradition. So, in what way is Poe technically what technically makes a Gothic writer? I'm interested in both uh, the technical aspect of it, but as you said, I'm really interested in what Poe was doing with that. But just so I'm educated, like
Well,
why
okay.
is Poe outside the box in
All right.
that?
Well, first of all, the Gothic is it's kind of like I know you were we had talked earlier about uh, Dario Argento.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
the Giallo is it's kind of the same thing. It's like it's hard to pinpoint what it is, but you know it when you
Mhm.
see it. There are certain tropes that come into play. There's this obsession with the past. There's usually some kind of an involvement with the supernatural. There's all things about guilt and family curses and gloomy castles and things like this. It's kind of a dark romanticization of like the past and things like this. And there's
And an
this
aesthetic, right? There's also
yeah
like to the layperson like myself, I know the Gothic aesthetic, and Poe. We would put Poe in that. Certainly, the story that you just read is full. Whether I don't know whether it's what if it would fall technically Gothic or not, but it's Gothic as hell,
yeah
right? It has all those things
yeah
that you
oh
just
yeah oh
spoke
yeah
about. So,
yeah and there's and in my I wrote extensively in the Book of Shadows about the individual tales, and I talk about the influences and where I got things from. And a lot of them, I wrote them, uh, kind of off the top of my head, and then went back and realized, oh, I got this from here. Oh, I got that from there.
yeah,
It's like all
isn't
the
that the way?
influences.
That isn't that the way it often goes, right? Like when we inspiration, right? It comes from out of the blue, but when we're sitting and writing
Mhm.
liner notes, or as fans of it as we do, we think about it. Then, at least for me, and then it would dawn on me. Oh, it totally makes sense now. Well, even if I didn't see the line when I was writing it, I could totally see the line after
Mhm.
the fact.
Well,
Um,
and some of it is I know is like a mixture of like literature and cinema that has influenced me. Like I realized after the fact, like the red window in the tower, that's totally the Mask of the Red Death. That was the black room with the red painted window. and that was the image in my mind, and I didn't realize it at the time that it was from the Mask of the Red Death. But after I got it out there and I went back, I think it was actually when I watched the Blu-ray for the Mask of the Red Death. I just got uh, remastered and all that, and I picked it up and I was like, oh crap. I said, I said, there's the red window, that's his red window, and I mean, there's other things. I mean, it's like we're constantly absorbing stuff. There's references to uh, the like the Grimm fairy tales are very big for me. I grew up with those. There's like the I think Maid Maleen, the kind of thing about a young woman who was shut up in a tower by her own father, who had these
Mhm.
incestuous feelings for her, and didn't want any other men to look at her or do anything. And that's kind of like Adalbert taking Morbidezza and sealing her up in this tower, so she's only for him. And
You're hitting on all the themes that I want to ask you about, and I am going to
mhm,
ask you about horror
uh-huh,
stories, horror movies, fairy tales.
mhm,
Those are the things that came to mind as I was preparing to talk to you. But before we go further down the road on that, I want to
mhm,
ask you. Um, some of us might know it, some of us might not. If you could tell us what is a book of shadows, where all your and then tell us why you chose to call your book the Book of Shadows, to encompass all these stories
uh-huh.
with this dark range of influences that you have.
Right. Well, the Book of Shadows is usually a book that contains all the lore and everything for a particular coven. It's kind of like their guidebook or whatever. Has their spells and their things and everything. This is where they keep all their their meeting notes and what have you, and it's their book of reference. Um, and the as I mentioned in the book, in the introduction, is actually, if you don't mind, I'll just read this briefly over here, so because it explains exactly
Please,
what you just asked me. This is from the introduction. Whoops, there we go.
complete
Introduction
with
to the Book of
that.
Shadows. Complete with bats. Yeah, that's the theme for the collection. There you go. Um, What is a Book of Shadows, you ask? Well, ostensibly, it is a book kept by a high priest or priestess containing the tenets and rituals of a particular coven. If you're not a Wiccan or an occultist, you may have first heard the term mentioned on the WB TV show Charmed from 1998. The origins of the concept are debated, but the term was popularized in the mid 20th century by Gerald Gardner, the father of Wicca. Um, when I first created my blog back in 2011, at the recommendation of my longtime friend, Y. Mike Yazanaski, I racked my brain for a suitable title for a place where I could post my writings, reviews, poems, stories, etc. And then it hit me, Manny's Book of Shadows. That's my blog. It has since evolved over the years as the site has become more of a medium to keep interested parties updated on my publication appearances. Let me see. But anyway, so that's where it came from. As I figured, it was my little book of spells, or so to speak. But interestingly enough, and again, I didn't realize this until after the fact, when I was going through it. There's a lot of shadow figures and shadow references to shadows appear a lot in the book. In the different stories and the poems, there's lots of references to shadow creatures, shadowy places, the shadow side. So it's kind of appropriate that it turned out being called the Book of Shadows. And then at the end, the very last tale in the section of the devil and all his works, where I have all my kind of diabolic tales and prose poems and what have you. The very last tale, the Nativity in Black, ends with
Mm.
an image of shadows kind of overtaking
It's
the world.
yeah, it's amazing how we don't necessarily think we're writing a theme, or we don't necessarily think we're doing something like that. Yet when you put them all together, you're like, well, okay, yeah, there it is. That's definitely there. I did it. I wrote it,
Mhm,
whether you're doing it intentionally.
mhm,
You mentioned a really rich mix of influences and backgrounds. I had the good fortune to, I did hear you read a while back, maybe it was last summer. My sense of time is a little bit off here, but
mhm,
I remember you were reading on Facebook Live, and if I'm not mistaken, you were talking about another one of your influences, and I hope I'm not getting this
mhm.
wrong, but you were mentioning the author Clark Ashton Smith, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Somebody I'm a student of dark fiction. I love
Uh-huh.
dark fiction. I write dark fiction. I didn't introduce myself. I'll introduce myself for the second half of the show, but hopefully people know me. But yeah, Clark Ashton. It was right at the time that I was just I'm a latecomer. I was learning about Clark Ashton Smith,
Mhm.
reading the story too. So can you tell me what about Clark Ashton Smith appeals to you? Maybe what's one of your favorites, and yeah, how it influenced a story, perhaps in the Book of Shadows.
It did. Um, well, Clark Ashton Smith was a colleague of H.P. Lovecraft. Um, he was from California, and he's known for his really uh, what's the belletristic poetry and prose, and he's a much better poet than Poe ever was, and his poetry is just amazing. I love his use of language. I love his imagery. I love the things he talks about. It's very dark, very dismal, very macabre stuff, very bleak, but it's beautiful. And he has a slight, like a real, how could I say, like a real sardonic sense of humor, very dry, but it's there, and I love that about him. And I actually wrote two stories that are directly related to things that are from Smith. They're both um, take place in his. Uh, he has a couple of different realms that he writes about. His own, like Lovecraft has Arkham and all this.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, Smith has his own realms that he writes in, but they're more fantastic. They're more like from different dimensions or different worlds and things like this. And
Mm-hmm.
then they're not quite as uh, part of our world as like, let's say,
Yeah,
Arkham or
I
something
think I
like that
remember
would
you
be.
were reading. What was it? What are the names of those two tales? Because I believe I heard you read from at least one of them. What are your two stories set in his world?
Well, my stories actually both take place in his realm called Averwanye, which is
Ah,
actually
okay.
one of the my favorite one because it actually is connected to the real world. It's a made up region in France, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like a combination of a couple of different provinces and places in the French countryside, the Auvergne, and as another town. It's another A name. It
Yeah,
escapes me right now. That
I
that was known for having like witchcraft and stuff in the real world
so it's kind
back
of
in the
funny
day.
for me to mention this, but so much, so much classic. I'm not up on my classics. I'm not up on my Clark Ashton Smith. But
Hmm.
as a boy, I played Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm pretty sure Gary Gygax was influenced by Clark Ashton Smith. Especially he did in one.
Hmm.
There was a module, I believe it was called Castle Amber, and it all came back to me learning about that. So
Well, sure, because he was one of the early proponents of sword and sorcery, but instead of being taking it from the Robert E. Howard Conan the Barbarian thing. His was more really dark wizards and things like that. You know, that was more his. He leaned more to the sorcery than the swords. And
Was your story a werewolf
his
story?
heroes seldom make it through the stories.
What was the name of I'm trying to zero in on the name of those two stories.
Oh,
What was the name?
I'm so sorry. There's
It's okay.
the Felfet, which appeared in the Clark Ashton Smith uh, tribute book, the Averwania Legacy, from Pickman's Press, and that was edited by Edward Stasheff, and that was actually one of my very first publications, along with Spectral Realms. And then the other piece is Rosaire, Master of Wolves, which is actually in here. And actually, we have a picture.
That's the one that I heard you read from. So
Yeah, Rosaire, Master of Wolves. I think I read like the first section. Uh, and there he is. I gotta figure out where the camera is on this thing. There's Rosaire.
a great
Woo!
Dan Sauer
Uh,
illustration.
yeah, and
So
that
so yeah,
that was. Mhm.
go
I'm sorry,
ahead,
what?
please.
No, I was going to say
Oh, no,
that
sorry.
was influenced by a couple of different things, aside from Clark Ashton Smith, because it actually takes place in Averwania. Because there's a collection that was a Robert M. Price, one of those, oh gosh, those books. Oh God, what's the series? It's they do like tribute stories and stuff like that. Uh, uh,
Mm.
it's Chaosium. It's Chaosium Books, and it's Robert M. Price was the editor on those, and he did a collection of uh, unreleased early drafts of stories by Clark Ashton Smith, and in there is one which is an early version of the oh gosh, what is it, the Beast of Averwania, and it's called The Werewolf of Averwania, but there's frustratingly no werewolf in the story. And I said, for all the talk about the haunted, the werewolf haunted woods of Averwania, there should be a werewolf story. And he has a werewolf story. It doesn't even take place there, and he doesn't really get into it. It's like a passing thing, and it doesn't really do anything for me. I said there has to be a werewolf story taking place in
So
that realm. So I
so
wrote Rosaire. Um,
which so you stepped up to the plate. You became the werewolf you wanted to see.
I did
And
exactly that, and there's a little bit of my friend Galad Elflinson, his uh, the Black Wolf. He wrote the novel The Black Wolf, which is has kind of a mythos theme to it, and there's a little bit of influence of that. And as Brenda was mentioning earlier, Angela Carter, one of my favorites. She's like her Bloody Chamber. Holy crap! That book.
mm,
It's. I just read that over and over. It's like I
I'm gonna,
try so hard to
I
write
have
like her.
Brenda's
It's never
book
going to
on
happen.
now.
She's another one. Her use of language. It's amazing. Her wit. Just it's incredible. It blows my mind. And there's some vague. If you've read her stories and stuff. Uh, I use some of the same language and things like that. It was a really big influence. Both her and Clark Ashton Smith uh, uh, are big influences on my use of language and how I describe things, as well as obviously Poe, because Poe is just it's part of my DNA now. Um,
You've got so you're throwing so many excellent things at me that I just want to follow up on a couple of them before
mhm.
you give us some even more great stuff. I wanted to ask you, so you put the werewolf in the story. I wanted to ask you, it's so apparent from looking at the Book of Shadows that you have a love, both you and Dan have a love of the classic monsters, the
Mhm.
vampires, the werewolves.
Hmm.
What is the appeal to you as a writer about writing about some of these more yeah, there's no other way
Traditional.
of putting it. Like the traditional, the classic. I know
Well,
it goes hand in hand with your style, with the Gothic style,
mhm,
and the Gothic subject matter. So what's the
mhm.
appeal of the classic monster?
Well, for me, it's kind of like trying to bring them back to what they were, because those things have lost a lot of power to the modern mind. Like people are like witches. What's so scary about witches? Well, because you don't know witches the way witches were perceived back in 16 something. That's it was a very real thing to them, and these are the things that scared them. I have like a witch poem in here which uses a lot of the old tropes and stuff, and werewolves too. When I wrote Rosaire, I went back to like Montague Summers, the werewolf book, and Sabine Baring Gold, the Book of Werewolves. I went back to original transcripts from werewolf cases and stuff like that, and I picked and chose different things, uh, from those original tales that people were saying back in the day, the things that made these things scary before, like Abbott and Costello kind of ruined it by,
Yeah,
making fun of them,
I must. I can't resist. You mentioned witches and their perception thereof, and it's not only back in the day. I mean, a relatively, what's a classic movie I'm going to bring up, relatively modern, at least when we're looking at the 1600s, is a movie you mentioned, or at least you mentioned Dario Argento earlier
Mhm.
on. Dario Argento is on my mind. He's in New York this week. There's an
Oh, wow.
Argento retrospective film fest. I
Hmm.
was fortunate enough I got to see him introduce a restoration of Suspiria, which is very much
Oh, wow,
a
that's cool.
which is very much a witch movie. And
Hmm.
what I'm about to say is not being critical of Suspiria because I do love the movie.
Hmm.
I love Argento and I love his vision,
Hmm.
but it is very much the perception of the witch in a lot of society, in a lot of culture, and
Hmm.
especially in Argento's movie, the witch is evil with a
Hmm.
capital E. We don't
Hmm.
have the witch's story. We don't have the witch as the good guy. We don't have the witch as their story. Like Argento is he's an old Italian man, and
Yeah.
I know he didn't speak much, but when he was introducing Suspiria, he did speak of I did my research and I went around Europe and was trying to understand the witch and
Hmm.
what we get is his singular vision.
Well,
You
with
know,
the help of Daria Nicolodi.
the
I mean,
design,
yeah.
yeah, her designs, and I believe they were married at the time. You know, the
Uh-huh.
designs of that were very much what you spoke of the at least the gothic aesthetic. So it's
Hmm.
a great time to ask you. You mentioned that the horror movies. You're an aficionado of them for sure. Um, what are some of your favorites? And you mentioned they inspire you. What are some of the ones that inspired you most, and why?
Oh gosh, yeah, opening up a can of worms there.
Or you can tell me you can tell me
Well, I
what
can.
you love about
All
Argento
right.
or Suspiria.
I'm sorry. What?
I said if that's too deep a rabbit hole, please just tell me before I get to my final question for you. You can just tell me what you love about Argento and Suspiria if it's too deep a hole to go down.
Well, I can do a brief summary of some of that, and then get to your to Argento, because for me Argento is more of a secondary thing. With my love of the Gothic and all that, I grew up watching the Universal horror films of the 30s. Uh, Bela Lugosi, Dracula, Boris Karloff, Frankenstein, and all that. Those were a big influence on me. My cousin Jason Kafega and I, we were monster kids. It's like all the other kids were into superheroes and all that, and he wanted to be Dracula, I wanted to be the Frankenstein monster. And
Mhm.
that those were our heroes, and those are the things that we grew up with. When I got a little older, I got into The Hammer films. I love the Hammer films. I love that the the gothic romance, and the it's I love that in your face color, the real lush color. I love the gothic themes. Um,
So you said you wanted to bring, when I asked you about
mhm.
how they appeared in the Book of Shadows, you said you wanted to bring them back because they've gotten away from it in a while. Is that so? Is
Mhm.
that what you meant by you just wanted to bring back that aesthetic, that color, those monsters in your
Well,
Book of
yeah, because I
Shadows,
mean,
some of
like
the
I said,
inspiration?
it's like now, vampires, do karate and they sparkle and they do this and they do that. It's like vampires are undead creatures, like they make it like, oh, it's a disease, or oh, they're sensitive, or they're this or they're that. It's like, no,
Okay,
that's not a vampire. That's it's this as the vampires changed over the time, and werewolves and what have you, they I guess they change with the way, whatever people are feeling at the times and stuff, and they represent, whatever the
so you
the
wanted to go
main
back
thing.
to
But I wanted to go back what made them
some of the classic.
scary in the first place. I wanted to remind people, hey, you know uh, werewolves didn't just change when the moon was full. Werewolves used to, rub a balm on their skin and they'd put on a wolf pelt. They could change whenever the hell they wanted to, and they were eating babies, and they were doing all this crap. And vampires, their breath stank, and they'd come and they'd wear out their wives, and they'd come and they'd do this and they do that and they'd do all these horrible, wretched things, and and witches and all this. It's like I wanted to bring back the things that made these things scary in the first place. But at the same time, I love these things, and I kind of lean more towards the uh, the side of the monster rather than the heroes. I do have I grew up Catholic. I left, not to get uh, too into it, but I left the church when I was a teenager. I never looked back, but it's in my head, all that the imagery and the stories and everything. So, I have all these things in my subconscious that come out when I start writing these stories.
Speaking
So it's
of the
like it's these old
subconscious,
world views of these things, But I kind of try to change them on their head. Like, oh, I mean, like Morbidezza, you know. I sympathize with Morbidezza in that story, not with Adelbert Glady. That guy
I
is
I've unmuted Brenda's mic, Manny, for a second
okay.
because I want to. The last question I want to touch on with you before our time goes.
Hmm.
Speaking of the subconscious, and speaking of werewolves, and speaking of the classics,
Hmm.
something we spoke about earlier was Angela Carter, and Angela Carter just is synonymous with the fairy tale and with the dark fairy tale.
Oh yeah.
I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of Tanith Lee.
Hmm.
I'm a student of Angela Carter as I'm discovering
Hmm.
her work. So I want to ask both of you, um, what is what is the appeal of the dark fairy tale to you as a reader, and what is the appeal as a writer, particularly like the dark fairy tales like Angela Carter?
Brenda,
Yeah,
do
you
you
can
want to go
go to Manny,
first?
and then we'll throw it over to Brenda. And
Okay.
Oh, you want me to go
Um,
first? Oh, or
yeah,
well,
go
no, no,
ahead.
you can go first.
or jump on in, jump on in. Yeah, jump on in, Brenda.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say the appeal to me because Angela Carter was a radical feminist,
Hmm.
she, so the idea of taking fairy tales that often had bad endings for the feminine psyche and body and seeing her revolutionize it by turning it on its head and giving women autonomy and authority over their bodies, over choice. For instance, in her retelling of Bluebeard, the mother rescues, the mother comes in and rescues.
Hmm.
So the idea of being able, you know, the pin is a mighty weapon. And those dark fairy tales, for me, especially where Angela Carter is concerned, gives especially a female writer, it gives us power. And for
Yeah.
females that are reading, it gives them power because it lets you think of other ways to view the world, ways of escape, ways of taking back power. Um, so for me, that is the appeal um, of dark fairy tales, especially Angela Carter. She's just her poetry, her other stories that may not be quite as dark. Everything she does is so inspiring to me, or did. She's long passed on,
Mhm.
um, but her legacy lives on through the storytelling of those who have studied and are devoted to her writing.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really strikes me about Angela Carter and Tanith Lee is that we're starting from um, that very point that you mentioned that hey, these classic fairy tales, they don't end well for women at all, and
Have you read some
I can
Russian ones?
yeah, I mean,
And European
I'm just coming
ones?
with the
Oh my
dark
God.
retellings of Tanith Lee. She named her book "Tales from the Sisters Grimmer," and
Mhm.
yeah, so
That
it's a
was
great
another big
it's a great
book
thing
for
that
me. Yeah.
Mm.
it was a huge it's a huge book. Another a
Uh-huh.
lot of gothic in there.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you Manny as a writer, what is the appeal of the fairy tale? I know I think there even is a section in your book where you mention the Brothers Grimm right
Mhm.
here in the back somewhere. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I talk about that in the oh gosh, it's the afterword. Oh, Tales from a Brother Grimm. Yeah, and I guess for me, like I said, like I say in that little essay, it's like I like the I guess the crap. Let me when you put on the spot, it's like hard to get the
oh,
words
don't let
out.
me put you on the spot. Don't
No,
let me
no, no,
put you on
no.
the
It's
spot.
okay. Let me see. I could just no, 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 no. Uh, crap. Yeah.
While
Well,
you're
well.
looking for it,
Yeah.
I wanted to.
Basically, I like that. I like the kind of magical uh the way it's the oh God, I can't even speak. It's the going back to the primordial uh, fears and concerns, original story tropes. It's going back to the basics, just like I was talking about, the Gothic stuff, going back to the original tropes and the original beliefs and ideas. And with fairy tales, I like the whimsy, I like the magical aspect of it, and how totally absurd, weird things can happen and no one bats an eye. It's
Mm,
real open, innocent storytelling, and it's very pure.
and
And it taps
you've got
into a lot of things from our psyches, and it goes back to the original tropes, and
you've got
that's what
time
I like about it.
for one more story for you. You're going to read. What do you have in mind for us as your
Well,
story from the
I
published
was
house?
hoping I was originally gonna read Gothilux. I don't know if I have time for it. Uh,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, yeah.
Well, why
Okay.
don't you give us an
All right.
introduce Goldilocks, and then we'll turn it over to you. Why is
Okay.
this one that you decided to pick? I see we've got some classic monsters
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
illustration, and if
yeah.
you could tell our readers
Well,
how does it
I
fit
decided on
into?
this because it's actually a section in the book, the misadventures of Gothilocks and other children of the night, and I actually wrote this uh, maybe around 2000, 2001, if even. It was actually part of I was in a, I went back to school. I went to um, community college, and I was in a creative writing class, and the teacher was trying to explain to us the idea of the protagonist, and he brought up the fact that the story Goldilocks um, is kind of peculiar in the sense that depending on the viewpoint of the reader, who is the protagonist here? Is it a story about a young girl who gets lost in the woods and goes into a house and, oh my goodness, it's inhabited by bears? Or is it a story about a family of bears who decide to take a walk to let their food cool off, and when they come back home, there's this interloper in their midst, so who's the protagonist there? And
So,
then the teacher told us, okay, now I want each of you to write your own tale using the Goldilocks framework or plot, and write your own fairy story. So,
we'll,
you
we'll
know,
turn it we'll turn it over to you. This is
yeah.
Manuel Arenas and Gothylocks.
hmm And here we go. And so they sat, the count, the werewolf, and the monster, alternately staring at the dreary countenances of their compeers and the mean mess spread before them. "What I would give for a nice young milkmaid to feed on," lisped the Count through his mustachioed overbite. "Yeah," growled the werewolf, sorry. "And when you were done draining her, I could take her limbs to gnaw on, then salt the remains and hang them in the smokehouse for jerky." "Jerky would be nice," muttered the monster. The werewolf, hirsute ears perked up to attention, rejoined, "I thought you were a vegetarian." "Yeah? Well, maybe I'm getting tired of all this squirrel food. Ever think of that?" retorted the monster. "I need to find something I can really sink my teeth into." "Amen to that," blurted the Count, raising his slender, albescent digit for emphasis, its pointed nail practically piercing a waxen stalactite from a guttering candle on a low-hung folksy chandelier. "Something with resistance that wouldn't crack my brittle denture," the monster continued as he absent-mindedly ran his large, leaden hand along his broad, ashen jaw. "Hey!" his lupine messmate howled mincingly. "You're the one who said, 'I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment.'" The monster, frustrated and avowedly embarrassed, clenched his teeth and, pounding his ponderous fists on the table, responded with an agitated "Arr!" "Gentlemen, please," hissed the Count. "We'd Why don't we go for a walk in the woods and work out some of this pent up choler?" The other two mumbled their assent, and off they went. Gothylocks had lost her way in the enchanted forest looking for a troppa bella donna to blanch her complexion, which was just not pale enough for her taste. Even though she was renowned for her dark tresses, which framed her lovely face in jetty ringlets, she secretly coveted the pallor of that bitch Faustine, who was so wan and willowy that she looked positively consumptive. "I'm going to achieve that ghostly hue some day," Gothylok swore, "even if it kills me." For a self-proclaimed child of the night, the little darkling was starting to wax a shade worried now that she noticed the onset of dusk blanketing the treetops in heavy folds betwixt the grasping, bony branches. She had all but lost hope of finding her way back home in the dimming light when she came upon an ill-favored cottage in a clearing. Gothylocks felt weary and hungry, so she decided that, as this was the only shelter that she was bound to find so deep in the woods, she would go the vole and make her approach. Granted, it was a tad forbidding in appearance, but she would have to make do with what was at hand. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the twilit window, the view into which was obstructed by a crimson velvet curtain, and stopped to prim herself in anticipation of her audience with the denizens of this lowly hovel. She wanted to look her best so that they would automatically take her in on account of her exquisitely coiffed locks and fetching good looks. She stepped up to the weathered wooden door, grabbed the ornate metal knocker, and rapped 3 times. Awaiting a response, she noted to her disfavor that the knocker was fashioned in the likeness of a lolling tongue of a leering devil, which caused her to cringe, then throw a peaked glance at her lily white hand. No answer. Pulling a red silk kerchief from her satchel, she wiped her hand clean. Then, using it to grip the rude clapper, she tried again, only this time a little more forcefully, and to her surprise, the door swung open. Drawing a deep breath, she restored the kerchief to its place, then pulled back the hood of her cloak, spruced up her corseted décolletage, and boldly sashayed across the threshold, where she stopped for a moment, arms akimbo, to take in her surroundings and seek out a host to charm. She hallooed into the antechamber, but there was no reply from within its shadowy stillness. Advancing with caution into the dining room, she noticed an oblong table covered in a gray linen cloth, with 3 places set for supper, lit by a Lustavibchen chandelier that barely illuminated the gloomy scene with its expiring candle nubs. The picture featured a painted wooden figurine of a pallid raven-haired woman resting on a candle beam fashioned from a pair of deer antlers. On her crown she bore a diadem with a silvery orb flanked by crescents. In her left hand she held aloft a flambeau, and in her right a coat of arms bearing a skull and crossbones. How tacky, Gothilok snarked, eyeing it with disdain. At one end of the table was a shallow metal bowl with a viscous red fluid in it. She looked to the side of the bowl but saw no utensils. Screwing up her doll-like features to inspect the ruddy contents of the bowl, she mused. What is this? Borscht? Nope, there's no sour cream. It must be gazpacho. Either way, I don't do cold soup, and this stuff looks like it's starting to congeal. Spying something beneath the clotted surface, she grasped the bowl by the edges and gingerly sloshed the contents to reveal the alarming high-relief image of a face devoid of any features, save for a gaping mouth. Spooked, she resiled, dropping the bowl, which caused some of the fluid to spill onto the tablecloth, leaving an incarnadine splotch. Taking a deep, calming breath, she moved on to the next place, where sat a wooden dish with a large bone that bore several sizable and unsightly tooth marks on it, indicating that it had been chewed voraciously by something with a measurable bite. What? They let the family dog eat with them at the dinner table? Ew. Wait, is that a femur? Disgusted, she pushed away the bone and went to the last place at the table, where she found a bowl full of what she assumed to be trail mix. Figuring this is as good as it was going to get without any host in sight, she ate it all up and washed it down with a swig of bottled water from her satchel. Feeling sleepy, she plodded up the alternating steps of the narrow staircase leading to the dormitory quarters in the loft. There she saw a coffin, which she climbed into precipitously because she always wondered what it would feel like to be in one. However, it proved far too unnerving for her liking, so she clambered out in a trice and, stumbling, landed on her derriere on a straw-filled mattress. The palliasse served well enough to break her fall, but was repellent with animal sweat and shed hair, so she quit it post haste. Lastly, she came across what she took for an antique bedstead that had a bolster pillow at one end, but no bedclothes. Presumably, the mattress had been the one that she had just vacated, no doubt removed due to its doggish taint. Although it was a bit unyielding in its design, the frame reminded her of some minimalist accommodations she had seen once in a magazine. This is no worse than my box spring at home, she thought, and pulling her cloak close around her fatigued frame, she removed her high leather boots, stretched out her stockinged legs, and was soon asleep. Now the night was waning, and our boys were flagging from trudging around the forest and venting spleen, so they agreed to head back to their meager supper and retire before the looming cockcrow. Upon arrival, they were flummoxed to find the front door to their creepy cottage ajar. Filing one behind the other, They entered with caution, the palpabous count leading the way, arm braced forward, and ruddled eyes peering out from between his grizzled brow and his heavy black cape. The werewolf followed at his heels, beady black eyes narrowed, snout to snarl, claws out for an attack, and the monster trailed behind, his yellowed eyes wide as doubloons, nervously scanning about the chamber, like an oversized and misshapen boy frightened out of his patchwork gourd. In the main room, where the meal had been set, they found a sight which caused the trio some concern, and for the monster at least, a great deal of dismay. Someone has spilt my plasma potage, cried the Count incredulously. Someone has been hovering around my marrow bone. I can smell it, gnawed the werewolf. Someone has eaten all of my muesli, sobbed the monster. Now I won't have anything to eat for supper tonight. Don't worry, mon frere. All is not lost, the werewolf said to the monster as he patted his elbow reassuringly with a hairy black-clawed hand. For I smell an intruder in our midst. The werewolf then led his unearthly friends up the staircase into the loft where they found a disturbing scene. Recoiling as if from a crucifix, aghast at the thought of a plebeian desecrating his immaculate crib, the Count gasped, Someone has been in my coffin! Someone has been snooping around my pallet, gnawed the wolf irately. Yeah? Well, someone has been sleeping on my slab, and they're still there, bawled the monster. Where am I going to sleep now? The eldritch trio stood around the monster's bier and marveled at the beauty of their uninvited guests. Boy, she sure is pretty, the monster mumbled as he rubbed the tears from his eyes and wiped his sutured nose on his frayed, dingy coat sleeve. Yeah, her hair's so black and shiny, said the werewolf in a hoarse whisper. I just love the way the curls frame her perfect little face. I mean, look at that skin, white as alabaster. I've seen whiter, the Count interjected, but yes, she was a fine specimen. The werewolf grinned a toothy smile, with a hint of a snarl in his voice, slyly uttered, Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The Count, leering, licked his livid lips in response as the monster turned to regard his comely usurper and affirm, Jerky. I can't hear you guys.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So that was, I wanted to say thank you to Manuel Arenas for reading Gothylocks from the Book of Shadows. Stay with us, Manuel, and at the bottom of this hour, we'll be back with you and Brenda to let everyone know where we can pick up your books. I'm gonna mute your mic now, and before we head over to our second hour, where we're going to talk with Brenda Tolian, I'll introduce the show again. This is Nighttime Logic, a dark, strange summer, June 23rd, summer of 2022. I'm your host, Daniel Braum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the author of Underworld Dreams and strange short stories and strange tales. Please feel free to check out our event page where you can find more information about Manuel and Brenda and where to pick up their books and where to join us for the rest of the series. We're going to hear at the bottom of the hour, we're going to hear Brenda read from her new book, which just came out from Raw Dog Screaming Press, Blood Mountain. I have how are you doing, Brenda? It's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I want to start off the top of this hour with a quote from Blood Mountain. You see a raven and a hawk sharing opposite ends of a telephone pole, just waiting for something to turn up dead. And that's an excerpt. That's just a line that stuck out to me, as many of your lines did. There's in the book of stories, Blood Mountain, there are some interstitial narrative passages that are present between the stories, and I think we're going to hear from one of them tonight. Birds and all sorts of animals and flora populate the tales. My first question for you is, what is it about the natural world that is that's vital to this collection of stories and to your storytelling?
I think because the valley that I'm speaking of is the San Luis Valley, and it is a very beautiful place. You feel very small when you're walking anywhere in it because you have the San Juans on the one side and the Sangre de Cristos on the other. You're like in this bowl of mountains, and then the valleys, pretty flat. So if you're standing in the valley, you can see the mountains to either side. It's a high alpine valley. It's also a desert, technically. But there's also, as much as we call it a desert, it also has a lot of life. And it's always been a struggle to exist in this place. It's as beautiful as it is, a lot of those things can actually kill you, or just, the elements in general. And so it's impossible to tell the stories that I wanted to tell without also talking about the mountains, the mountain creeks, the Rio Grande, the river that runs through that gives life to our valley. And it's also a valley that's there's been a lot of different groups that have come and, for their own purposes, their own greed, to consume. And even right now, the valley struggles with things like water, because our water, they're fighting for rights to their own water there, so that it doesn't get piped off to bigger cities on the front face of the Rockies. So it's also
we East Coasters don't think of it. You and I were talking about it at one point this summer on messaging about it. But yeah, if you don't live on the West, your water might be something you take for granted there.
Yeah. And so, we have farmers there and ranchers who are trying to sustain their living, but even now in 2022 are still having their resources stripped from them. And it's just a constant battle. It's not a place that you can go off hiking by yourself, because it can be dangerous. There are bear, there are mountain lions, there are places to fall off of or fall into. You name it. There's, it's a southwestern environment, but it's also a very unique environment compared to a lot of the Southwest. It's also considered very sacred by the indigenous groups that have existed there, the Ute and the Apache and the Navajo, just to name a few of the groups, that call it, have always called it home, or called it their sacred place. So
I want to ask you, I have a bunch of things to ask about that before I get right on that. Here in the comments, I just want to let Manuel know. I'm not sure if you can see the comments. There are lots of clapping and lots of great reads. So cheers to you in there. But also in there, I'm going to put this comment on screen. I think this is someone was mentioning the power shift, as folklore as a power shift, in reference to the Angela Carter. But mentioning folklore, and you're mentioning the presences that preceded the Outsiders. It makes me think about your title story, Brenda, Blood Mountain. And on the one hand, it's the tale of the protagonist or the villain or the main character in that story is Saul Eaton, and he's a gold prospector. And without spoiling the story, in the course of the very dark happenings of that story, he's possessed by a supernatural entity in the mines there that we would perhaps call the Wendigo. And the story originally appeared in the book Consumed, Tales Inspired by the Wendigo.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us, in the context of Blood Mountain, tell us a bit about the Wendigo lore and how it fits into these things that you're telling us about the darkness, the danger of the natural world.
I think the Wendigo, the book was like the Wendigo Tales of the Consumed Tales of the Wendigo from the Denver Horror Collective was aptly named because each of those stories in that book looked at the Wendigo as like a constantly hungering, consuming body. And the tales in that book, it can be the Wendigo as we think of it as this cannibalistic morphed man who eats other humans. But in that book, it examined the Wendigo in so many other ways. And so when I think of it, and when I was thinking about it for, because when I published that, I also was working on my thesis, which is what this book is my master's thesis from Regis. And I was thinking about consumption just in general, with Manifest Destiny, colonization, that was occurring even before that, when the Spanish came into the Southwest. And I was thinking of the Anglos who came over from the East, pressing with their railroads and their desire for gold and silver and resources. And just like we are today, this constant hunger to gather wealth and resources to a particular set of people, to the detriment of so many others, including the environment, which is the conundrum we have right now, right, in the world. So I would, so as far as the Wendigo goes, I think of it as very symbolic of the hunger that drives us, a hunger that drives a person to eat and take without regard for other people, for other people's lives or livelihood or bodies or anything. So as far as, I know in that book, Al Going Back does, he writes kind of an essay, I guess you would call it, in the beginning of it, talking about it from an indigenous perspective. It's a beautiful essay, and you could totally build on that, on the mythology of it, but ultimately it's just kind of about that hunger. That
you did a great job of portraying it in the short story, and it's an aptly named, and it's a great title story for the book for all the reasons that you said. It works both literally as a literal tale of horror, and it's quite horrific, but it's not so hard to peel back the surface just a little bit and dwell in those themes that you're talking about, right there. The hunger, consumption, manifest destiny, and all the ways that all the ills of our so-called modern day. So it's not hard to imagine a character. There's a character. The setting is a character in your book, and I love that. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It's a recurring setting. It's a recurring character. It's a recurring element. I guess my question sort of is redundant, because I was going to ask you, what is it about the place that inspired it? Obviously, I could see, just talking to you, how the mountain itself it can be seen as a response to to all these elements. But it's also something. There's a lot more of it too. So what is it about the place that inspired you throughout all the stories in the book?
Well, I'm very research based, so a lot of my writing comes through research. It's gleaning the newspapers. It's reading the various news of the valley that comes across Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. It's also listening to people tell me stories. I'm a great listener. There's a lot of interesting things about the valley. You can look up. Did I send it to you? It was like the Vice. Yeah, like the Vice News.
I'm not sure what you've definitely sent me a couple of bits. I know. I know you mentioned some of the things you were researching, and also some little bit film clips or articles that I'm like, wow, yeah, this sure is math.
They're like, they have a long history of UFO sightings. They have chupacabra and skinwalkers and tales of brujas, which is Chicano Hispanic witches, I guess, right? Was that So I get that, and the good bless me Ultima word always mixed up. But there's just a rich history of storytelling. It is a valley full of poets and writers, from the students I had to many, many people I know that are excellent poets and storytellers. That you listen, you do your research, you ask the questions, and then you're very much inspired by this place because, like I said, you feel very small there. Because it's, the mountains are just so daunting on either side.
I'm going to ask you to, in the course of this next comment that I have, help me with the name of the story I think you're going to read from. Speaking of listening, the section, I think the interstitial section ends with a line, one of those great lines. It was never a white man's story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you still try. And that's going to come up in the context of what you're going to read.
Yeah.
But, can you tell me a bit about the Native American presence in the area and the name, the title of the bit that you're going to read? We'll get some questions coming up before then, but just as a little bit of a sneak introduction.
Well, because I'll read from one of the insets to kind of set it up, which is inset 2. But it's Eshten Luhi. I don't even know that I'm saying it right. I've practiced it many times and asked my Navajo friends to pronounce it. But it's the woman who changes. So this is an old myth particular to the Navajo. I think it's shared by a couple of the other nations that are in the area. Although I have to say, we don't have necessarily reservations or anything in the valley because they've all been pushed out farther west. But the idea behind this, that's not to say there isn't a lot of indigenous people who live in the valley and whatnot, but this story is the woman who changes, and I'm not necessarily telling it from the indigenous point of view. I don't really feel necessarily that is my story to tell. But I was wondering about, when I was doing it, I was like, what if an Anglo trader is on the Spanish Trail and he comes across her while she's making the change? Would he be able to understand it? Would he be able to see any of the beauty in it, and understand that it's necessary for the renewal of the land and everything, and would he be able to see it? So I kind of play around with that point of view, because isn't that a lot of history, unfortunately, is very ethnocentric, and it's coming from mostly a white telling of what happened. And so in this story, um, I'm just kind of looking through his eyes, and like there's obviously beauty in it if you can see it. There's often a lot of beauty in horror. And the way that of course I'm telling it is through a southwestern kind of gothic kind of feel. Um, but he's kind of like on that cusp of understanding, he doesn't really understand what's going on necessarily, and there's times when he's very afraid, but towards the end it makes the tiniest bit of sense to him, but still he's not going to fully grasp it because he's Anglo. He's just not going to.
I think that we're going to hear that story at the bottom of the hour. Two points that I really liked in what you were setting up there. The first is I'm glad you mentioned different perspectives, and it goes side by. You mentioned it side by side with how often there is a sense of beauty in the horror, right next to that sense of dread. An emotion that I always think I love to, when I experience it in horror, and a lot of times in weird fiction. Sometimes, in like that author that Manuel mentioned, Clark Ashton Smith, side by side with that sense of dread is also like a sense. There could be a sense of awe, and there could also be that sense of beauty. But then you said if they could only see it, and of course it's like this. You in the book you have very different perspectives. Here's a line that I felt really captured that. I believe it's from the story you're going to read from. Mystery lay upon this land and opened as it desired, using various lenses and playing tricks. The tricks often ended with deadly results to those who did not tread with respect. So I think that line like really encompasses the presence of the mountain, the presence of outsiders, and just really encompassing those facts there. There are in fiction, there are often in fiction and in film, I often encounter a lot of uninformed or negative portrayals of Native Americans in fiction and in horror. For even in works that we love. I'm a big fan of Stephen King, but a lot of times his work can portray the Native American graveyard as a source of evil or as a source of horror. So it's like side by side in these works that we love, and it's also like, wow, okay, yeah, so you could tell some people maybe it's not necessarily Mr. King, but yeah, there's some people who take that easy way out and take that trope. What are some negative tropes that you've encountered, or what are some? And I think you've already answered my question. Is how does Blood Mountain differ in some of those portrayals?
I think just what you were talking about, especially when being an Anglo white writer, it's easy to fall into those tropes. Or tell tales that we don't necessarily need to be telling, that aren't our stories. So when you're doing that, you need sensitivity readers of people who are of the culture that you are writing, and I use those. If you're not using them, you should be. And then I think in this book, I was trying to show some of the damage done, instead of glorifying, the great white Western, sheriff, or cowboy or whatnot, this man, like Yellowstone. I know a lot of people love Yellowstone. I haven't watched it, but instead of glorifying that, looking at some of the damage done, because the damage done is paralleled in my book between also the feminine body and the earth. Like I have, the mountain range itself, the valley itself. So I parallel those two things. It was impossible to place a story in the valley without including indigenous voices. It was impossible. Like, how could you do that? As well as Hispanic and Chicano voices and characters. But mostly I focus on the perpetual Wendigo of the white man and the white woman and people who come and do things that are very, for instance, just cultural appropriation, So I was trying to. It was something that I was also seeing a lot of, and so in telling that tale, I wanted. There's another story I have of William Zuni, who is an indigenous man who was orphaned, and he doesn't know his history. Like, he knows that he's indigenous, but he doesn't know his nation. And he's kind of like a Dexter kind of fellow in that story. But that really came from watching a bunch of white people on stage were trying to play Native American music and invited the only Native American guy who was in the crowd and had him drug him up on stage, and he looked very uncomfortable. I was very uncomfortable for him. And what, I just got to thinking, like, what was he thinking, being drug up on stage with a bunch of white people who were trying to mimic a culture that wasn't theirs, So what was up with that, and how can I talk about that in the stories?
That's one of the things that I like about the book. There's a lot that I like about this book, but just what you mentioned, you didn't shy away from portraying the outsiders, and you coined a fantastic little turn of phrase there, the perpetual Wendigo of the white man, or of the Anglo, and that's a term that's going to stay with me. Before we went live, I didn't get the chance to tell the whole story, but we were mentioning I know I'm from the East Coast, and Manuel spent some time in New York, and somehow we brought up my first time in Mount Rushmore, and I was someone that didn't learn. Basically, I just learned the Native American history that they taught me in school, and it wasn't until I was physically at a place where I'm like, wait a minute, this is I was fed and swallowed and ate whole the propaganda of the quote unquote winning side. So that was always something that was part of my childhood, and Manuel and I we were talking about, when you write something and then you go to talk about it and you think about where the influences come, and then you see it. So that's one thing I really appreciate about Blood Mountain is because that's something that I like. I find myself writing about some of the similar issues that you're talking about, but the perspective that I'm bringing is often of the outsider, and I feel like the outsider can simultaneously be the perpetual Wendigo, and you could still have a character who has a sense of awe and a sense of beauty of it,
Mm-hmm.
and is still the villain and doing damage even without intent. Yeah, you can have. There's a lot of awful people. There are some Saul Eatons, and there are people like that. But then, there's also some of the stuff that really hits you is like, what's in my heart, or what's in my neighbor's heart, or what's in there, and as chilling, yeah, as chilling as stories are. Yeah, and there's some real horrific chills in Blood Mountain. Yeah, those are the other. That's another layer going on there.
I think you could have monsters in books, of course, you know, and in horror, we always have some sort of monstrous somebody or something, but oftentimes it's human nature that is far more monstrous and turns out to be far more scary, you know.
And I think, at least for my book, I mean, that's why I love the banner of horror, because it embraces so much, right? It can embrace, it can give us the monster that we love to hate and we love to fear and we love to be scared by it, right? The classic position, but then we can also deconstruct the monster,
Yeah.
and we can have, yeah, like that modern trend, of what you just said, of the horror stories ultimately giving us the glimpse into the human monster, even when there are monsters around. So
Yeah.
I am right there with you on that. There's one of the stories. One of the stories is called "The Stone Mother," and we get a different perspective. We get a lot of different perspectives of the mountain. So in the Stone Mother, you have your narrator, a young woman named Sarah, and she speaks of grandmother mountain. And there's another cool quote I want to point out, and she says, "I believe the mountain to be a living thing, watchful, waiting, drawing me in. I wasn't sure if I should fear it or let the mountain have its way. Mostly, I felt like I waited for it to direct me somehow, like a god." So, yeah, what can you tell us about that character, that story? There's a group of people in there called the Red Sisters and Sister Yana and the Blood Mothers. And if you could tell us what Blood Mountain, what the land means to those characters.
Well, ultimately, that story was rejected a couple of times for being too much. In this day and age, with women's autonomy over our own bodies being in question.
Well, look, so let's have some cheers. I'm sorry that I just interrupted you, but let's give some cheers to the small press. Let's give some cheers to Raw
Raw
Dog.
Dog Screaming Press. My dream press.
Jackanate Press. Look, there's a renaissance, there is a golden age of horror happening right now.
Yeah.
And it's just happening in the small press. I mean, you know, listen, rejection is a badge of honor because it means you're doing what you're supposed to do as a writer, and you're getting the stories out there, and we can't control that other side of it. So, but those stories will see the light. So
Yeah.
I interrupted you with some cheers to Raw Dog, but let's go back to those stories.
So, Stone Mother ultimately is a story of a woman who has made a choice, one that technically can't be walked back from, without spoiling it. But this, I would call it an extreme leftist group, I guess, because they're certainly not right wing. They're kind of gone back to paganism and whatnot, and exist on the mountain. And the Red Women are this governing body, spiritual body. They're very powerful, but they decide to reverse a choice that she had made. So ultimately, that story is really about, it's questioning autonomy of the body, and also the corruption of the idea of the mountain, because the mountain is not necessarily dictating or telling anybody what to do in that story. The mountain's very silent till the end. But it is a story that shows that you can take something and worship it and morph it and make it whatever you want to dictate how people live their lives and um, you know walk through the world, and again with that autonomy of the body. So if anything, it's kind of like, it's just religion in general, like when religion is used as more of a political power or a power that forces choices upon people, men, women, and children. um, and so it's kind of a dark folk tale for sure, that one. It's getting a lot more attention lately because of our political um, our political climate right now. It's definitely, I've been getting a lot of questions about that one. So you should just buy the book and read it, because it's really
what a climate it is. Before we're getting closer to hearing you read, so I'm really excited. But before, I have another question or two before we get to your reading. One of the things that struck me reading all these stories and reading them in sequence is they don't wrap up neatly. They don't wrap up what some writers have said. There's not a tidy, neat little bow on them, and that's just something that, for my 2 cents as a reader, that I find really pleasing. So they're atypical in resolution or atypical in structure. Tell me, if you could tell me something about these endings, talking specifically about the endings of your stories, or your process or thoughts on structures and endings of the stories you presented.
I think I ascribe to more like the postmodernist as far as how I write. I don't want it to be neat and tidy. I don't like neat and tidy stories. I want there to be tension all the way to the end, and I want there to be questions, questions that leave the reader wondering. Maybe leave the reader in such a state that they decide to write their own story to try and figure it out. I used to do that a lot when I was a kid. I don't think life ends nice and tidy. I appreciate a story that's clean cut and ends, and you have the gratification of understanding the beginning to the end. But I think I write to mimic, even though like there's not Wendigos and well, do we know? There's not Wendigos and skin.
There's a verisimilitude to your stories, right? Like whether or not we choose to believe, or whether we believe in the fantastic elements, for sure, your stories have a verisimilitude of life in them.
Yeah, I mean, I read everything from Stephen Graham Jones to Gambino Iglesias to Angela Carter, V. Castro, Katsu. I read my friends who are wonderful writers, such as yourself.
That's right.
So I get a lot of ideas from reading widely, and I find, and then I also jump into the classics and weird stuff that people don't always read, like Italio Calvillo and Steinbeck, but not what you're thinking. I was really influenced a lot by Pastures of Heaven, which is his earlier Gothic novel that actually didn't sell very well. And his stories didn't end in that book very tidy either. I think it's just the way that you choose to do it's an art. And I think I write like how I paint, and my paintings are very messy. So I think I'm just very, very messy. But I think it works.
An answer to a totally different place. I mean, I always draw. I haven't gotten to them yet, but we've spoken on different events before, and I always leave my events with you with my reading list that much fuller, right? Both from the classics to the modern people like Stephen Graham Jones and Gabino who are writing today. And
Yeah.
but yeah, now you mentioned I didn't. You reminded me to ask you. You're both you're a musician and a visual artist as well as a writer. And you're being quite humble by saying it's messy, but it's interesting to think to call a story messy in that way. I never thought of it that way. It sounds like a bit of synesthesia right there to just say the endings are messy. I think that's doing a little bit of a discredit to the story because these stories are just so tightly wrought and full of tension. But I could see how you're saying that messy, as in it's not wearing a tie and a suit.
Yeah, it's not gonna win a Pulitzer probably. And that's not the kind of writing I'm interested in doing. It's the same with my painting. A lot of times when I'm painting, I use my hands and I use knives, like actual knives. When I play piano, it's kind of messy, But as far as storytelling, that ending, I love an ending that the tension's still so tight you can't stand it. It's like being on a roller coaster that's not quite ending. Like when you get off and you still feel your body moving, that velocity still.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I was trying to. I feel a little uneducated because you said earlier in the question, you said, "Oh, I'm from a postmodernist school," and I have to admit, like, I'm just not educated that way. I'm like, oh, okay. Now I know I like that ending. Now you've just taught me that that's a postmodernist thing. I learned about that ending, or at least maybe the first time I can remember talking about that kind of ending was one of my teachers was Kelly Link, and she put it very much the same way that you just put it now. About she didn't use the roller coaster, but she used a car. She said she talked to her students and said, "Yeah, what about endings that when you're in a car and you have that sense of motion, and then you come to a stop, but then there's that sixth sense, there's that illusionary feeling that you're still going, but you're not."
Yeah.
And she's like, "What about endings like that?" And that just lit off all sorts of bells in me. And you just referenced it again, both in the sort of, those are the kind of endings that you like to write. And you put it really well, like this, to saying, yeah, that feeling on a roller coaster, that the story stopped, but it just stopped for us. The messy world, the messy lives. The hero didn't slay the dragon. The princess didn't behead the evil prince. The classic structural endings that we're used to, and that in many ways we like, aren't happening.
Well, I think like that one story, one of the stories, and I leave a young girl in a cave. She's just left in a cave, and with only the sounds that she thinks is the mountain speaking to her. I leave her there, just to keep that question in mind. Did she live? Did she die? Did the mountain take her? Like, what happened? And part of that too is if you're reading Blood Mountain and you happen to be out hiking, that's something else I love about horror. It's kind of like walking around New Orleans at night. Is Lestat behind me? Leaving that question of, is the danger, it's creating that unease that kind of can transverse from the book out into the world. If you're thinking about it later on and you're getting a little, think of any horror movie that scared you to death, and then maybe when you were younger or something, and then you were scared of what's under the bed, or you're scared of the woods at night, even though you're sitting right next to your mom, but you can just feel something out there. Like, that's the unease that I hope my writing does for people to a certain extent, but also thinking very deeply about the other themes and stuff too. But I hope to disrupt the brain a little bit and cause you to feel a little uneasy on your night walk. To be honest.
Yeah, we've seen some of your readers posting some of the brave ones, I think, have been brave or foolhardy enough to read from Blood Mountain out in the wild. But tonight, it's hot out. we're in the safety of our seats in front of our computer screen. So let's turn it over to you, Brenda, if you could introduce what you're going to read for us in the safety of our now almost darkened rooms, and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, I'm going to start with inset 2. There's a debate whether it's a collection of stories or if it's a composite novel. And so a composite novel is interlinked stories. And then all of the stories are linked by a central character in small insets, like vignettes, I guess you could say, small stories coming from the viewpoint of an undersheriff while he's on the job. And so I'm going to read inset 2, and then I will pause a moment and go into the next story. So here we go. No other mountain range drips blood as the sun sinks in the west. Some days it's only a dull pink, but most days it's crimson, so impossible that your mind can barely handle it. All those mountains wear Anglo names now, but you remember when some of the old-timers used to call them different names. Your grandfather remembered the stories of the first military posts were new here when the Spanish Trail was a trade route. Those stories were told to him when he was young. When you were a boy, he took you places and showed you the old bones of Fort Massachusetts, the petroglyphs, and the haunted places where nothing grew. He told you that the valley had once been a lake, more like an ocean, and you tried to imagine it, but couldn't. The old man told you another story that fascinated you as a kid, but now when you think about it, you shiver. The dead place still is marked by a twisted cottonwood. And as you turn your head, you can see it framed by the dunes as clear as you ever could. You wonder how that tree still stands and how deep the roots must be to drink from the aquifer. You went there once when the old man was put in the ground. A part of you wanted to catch a glance of her, the ancient goddess who changed in that place into something else. In the tangled roots, you heard the rattle of snakes and had to back off. If she was there, she had turned into something else entirely. Something you were acquainted with, death. A week later, you took up the badge and became a deputy. Death has followed you since. You find yourself laughing at that, reaching for the cold coffee and swallowing it down, the gun still in your lap, the blood dripping down the range outside the dusty windshield. The AM radio goes silent before Marty Robbins starts bleeding out 160 acres. You tell yourself to go home. You know when you stay out, Sandy worries, and she's endured 35 years of worry. You tell yourself so many things. Your hand circles around the gun in your lap. You tell yourself it's all okay, that it's all under control, and in a way it is. The cool metal, destiny, choice. You want to tell yourself that it wasn't always this way, but that is a lie of old men. You wonder if, in that last moment, you will see her walk out of that tree. It was never a white man's story to tell, yet you still try. And this is Eshtan a Louis. Jake first noticed the high-gliding ravens as he came around the monolith dunes. About 100 yards west of the trail, the birds were dancing in the turquoise sky on obsidian wing. He watched as their feathers splayed like fingers, catching the unseen breaths of the valley wind. They were not worked up just yet in a frenzy, nor swooping down like black arrows from the sky to eat their fill. They watched something in the distance with the patience of God. Jake tipped his hat back, slowing the horse. He spat through cracked lips and peered into the distance. He figured it could well have been anything out there, man or animal, injured or dead. He squinted, almost sunblind, and wiped his sweat-soaked brow with the back of his gloved hand. Jake watched for long moments, contemplating the lost time and the danger in investigating. He thought about the possibility of it being a man down who needed saving, and then thought about the problems and responsibilities that come along with being a good Samaritan. He'd lived a long time minding his own business. He looked eastward down the trail that was only 2 dusty ruts, wondering who thought such a thing needed a name as grand as the Spanish Trail. The path was long, unforgiving highway of mediocre profit, and there was no profit in being dead. There were small sections of the trail that draped over the mountain foothills, connecting oases of aspen, pinon, and raging alpine creeks. Then there were parts, such as where Jake found himself now, with the lonely emptiness of a graveyard, only visually touched by the flight of birds and cloud. Nothing moved in either direction, except the death vigil that circled overhead. To the east, the dunes rose, hundreds of feet high, the color of human skin shifting like the body of a sidewinder. Jake pulled his hat over his eyes to cut down on the glare that bounced from the sandy earth. Everything in sight had the remarkable aspect of both living and dead, out here in the vast open valley. The sagebrush looked like crouching men in the distance, and he couldn't shake the heavy feeling of eyes following him. The lonely land had the appearance of emptiness, and the feel of being crowded by ghosts, making him uneasy. Many before him, traveling from the east, had failed to recognize this, and often he found their sun-bleached bones cradled within the grasping hands of the rabbit brush. He waited patiently, and soon enough the shapes that seemed to have no movement began to flick tails or stomp a hoof, kicking up small plumes of dust. With those small actions, the vision was somehow augmented, and the vast herds of elk separated from the sparse vegetation as if they had suddenly grown up out of the earth. Mystery lay upon this land, and opened as it desired, using various lenses and playing tricks. The tricks often ended with deadly results for those who did not tread with respect. Jake investigated the sky, watching the slow circular dance of black. He decided to follow the windswept path of the ravens and see what they were waiting for, checking signs as he went. The air felt thin and charged, exciting his skin, standing his hair on end. He noted the feeling of heavy dread and waited for the cause to reveal itself. At first he saw nothing other than the occasional serpentine trail of a snake and the packed prints of elk. He studied them with practiced patience, able to read the tiniest impressions like a language. Here an elk bedded down, and here a mouse skittered before a hawk swooped down for a meal. Nothing unnatural, he thought. Jake could smell moisture on the wind and turned his head westward. The sky above the mountains began to build with the late afternoon storms. Sometimes he saw lightning sparking across the San Juan's rounded peaks. The once blue sky melted into the golden lace and muted purple, and a wall of stacked cumulus clouds pushed upward, fat and angry. Thunder rolled within the belly of the clouds with a promise. It wouldn't be long before he and his horse would be caught in a deluge of cold, hard rain. The storms here gave little warning, quickly racing over the parallel ranges, funneling down the gorges, picking up the earth and pushing it up into a solid wall of brown that swallowed everything in its path. Behind the wall would be another of ice, fire, and water so terrible that men were often never seen again. Sometimes they were found, their charred bodies still smoking from a direct hit by a thunderbolt, faces burned charcoal black, branded in expressions of agony. He was just about 100 yards off from the place where the ravens circled. Jake dismounted, boots sinking a bit in the sandy dirt. He hunched down, pulling on his gloves, all the while trying to find meaning, a story of what was ahead. Jake saw blood, dark and thick, floating atop the sand. He ran a gloved finger through it, bringing it to his face. The metallic smell hinted at its freshness, and the taste affirmed it. Jake spat, looking up, still not seeing what had the ravens so patiently revolving in the sky. He took a few more careful low steps, finding more blood, sitting Jew-like upon the rounded green clothes of the humble prickly pear. Something like fear crept up his spine. Nothing small would bleed this much. His boots made no sound, and what noise there might have been was drowned out by the quickening wind. Jake glanced up towards the Sangre de Cristo mountains as they started to turn red with the muted sun and the coming storm out of the San Juans. Everything in the valley seemed to be awakening in motion and color. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that some sort of dark magic enveloped this valley. He walked carefully, noting that the plant life was getting taller than expected for the time of year. He looked up to the mountains, still white with spring snow, and wondered if the rains were feeding the life here. The Navajo and the Ute held this valley sacred and rarely encamped here, and it took some getting used to traveling alone in such a desolate place. Mostly he didn't waste time here, preferring the action in the fort or the small community of Saguache. His travels weren't about sightseeing, but about finding a wife and settling down. As he got closer to the ravens circling above, he heard something moaning that even the wind couldn't muffle. The mournful sound was human, causing Jake to hesitate. Memories of the war bubbled up, of twisted bodies in blue and gray, soaking the ground in blood. Clenching his eyes closed, he pushed those troublesome thoughts away. After a few deep gulps of the heavy air, he opened his eyes again. Dark shapes were darting downward, breaking the boundary of the circle. They landed, watching him with their soulless black eyes. The ravens squawked, flapping their wings, pecking at the earth with their thick black beaks. Jake approached, still following the blood that covered the soil. He walked the few remaining steps and skirted unusually giant yucca cactus, all of which had glittering drops of blood upon their spiny leaves and thorns. The wind shifted, and upon its wispy breath the moaning changed into a keening language of a woman. The incomprehensible words rose and fell in a crescendo, pulling from his mind memories of the tribes that sang outside the fort. The song so haunting, setting his and every other soldier's teeth on edge. He supposed if it had been in understandable English, they wouldn't have worried so much, but the rattles and drums felt so exotic to the Easterners that they couldn't sleep those nights. Ahead of him, the voice lifted in high notes and then dropped into guttural moaning. He twisted away from the voice as thunder cracked behind him like a horrible sound of cannon fire during the Battle of Chickamauga. His knees went weak with the sudden intrusion of memory. A wall of wind approached, pushing rolling balls of tumbleweed before it. Jake watched the movement before feeling the spit of sand hit his face. The wind picked up, moving anything that was not rooted, like the valley mouth was exhaling. He pulled his hat down, holding it with one hand and covering his nose and lips with the other. Narrowing his eyelids into slits, he noted that the ravens did not move, but stood their ground with their heads buried in their wings. All around, the air filled with orange and brown particles. Jake focused on the disappearing and reappearing black forms. He could still hear the anguished cry beyond mixing with the howling of the wind. Each step forward was difficult with the shifting sand below and the wind pressing into his body as he made his way towards the birds. Patches of blue pierced the blanket of sand as the wind raced past him. As suddenly as the wall had come, it dissipated, leaving a deafening quiet in its wake. Jake brushed sand from his face as he walked bewildered at what the trail revealed in front of him. The vegetation was miraculously taller, tangled overhead like a long entryway. A raven bounced on clawed feet just ahead as if wanting him to follow, and all around he sensed the valley held its breath. Hesitantly, he took a step and then another. The piercing vocalization flowed up and down, beckoning forward. The deeper he went, the more the tangle of thorny plants pressed inward. Jake fought his way forward, ignoring the sharp spines that pricked his legs. The enclosure of brush and cactus thickened, scratching his face and arms, and he tried to fight the claustrophobic feeling of entering a labyrinth that he could not find his way out of. Again, the intrusive thoughts of corpses rooting in the trenches invaded his mind. For a moment he thought better of going forward, but then he tried to backtrack. Jake found the branches woven together impenetrable. Though the plants were green and desert dun, they looked like the tentacles growing together, thickening and sprouting fearsome teeth like barbs that sunk into the dirt. Hot bile rose in his throat, his legs felt weak. The plants grew under his hands, their surface warm. None of the plants should have been higher than his knee in the early part of June, and this freakish growth was beyond his explanation. A woman moaning pierced his ears. He pressed forward, thankful that the thick coat sleeves protected his arms. The damage continued. His clothing ripped, his body punished as if he were walking to Golgotha. The little bit of sky he could see churned. The pods of the yucca, unnatural in spring, began swelling and pushing open with audible pops all around. The yellow flowers filtering through the seasons in a single moment. He prayed in desperate whisper, but only the thunder and the keening voices ahead answered him. He still couldn't see what it was, but the sound made his bowels feel like jelly. Sweat ran down his back despite the teeth-rattling shivers that shook his body. The moaning was punctuated with agonizing screams, as if the holder was being sawed in half. The blood trail at his feet was darker and pooling in places. Nothing bleeding that much could be alive. The wall thinned suddenly, like clasping hands releasing. Jake tumbled from its grasp, falling face forward, hitting the ground hard. Eyes closed. He drew in a deep breath, inhaling sand and dirt, and he felt the damp of blood soaking through his clothing. Drawing his knees up, Jake curled into a ball and coughed hard, lungs burning. When the fit had passed, Jake slowly lifted his head. He wiped his gloved fist across his eyes, trying to clear the sand and blood. He was in an encirclement of writhing plant limbs. 2 feet away was a human form, whose mouth opened wide before emitting an ear-splitting scream. The dank odor of decay lay heavy in the enclosure, presumably from the dying woman, whose chest rose and fell in jarring movement. The cry rose and fell in laborious breathing, followed by chanting. The words sounded ancient, almost like a prayer, and Jake felt sure that she did not cry out to the God he had been begging for salvation. The old woman lay on a raised bed of rock and dirt. Her wrinkled body was draped in turquoise beads woven together into a great shroud. Her brittle body shook to keep up the song. Jake struggled to sit up, his legs and arms rubbery. He reached out, then thought better of it, crossing his arms across his chest, feeling blood oozing from the scratches and puncture wounds. He pulled off the tattered gloves, ripped along the seams from the strange vegetation. The woman's eyes were closed yet moved quickly underneath the lids as if in a dream. The yellow yucca petals continued to harvest from their pods, exploding, then floating in the air, settling on her body and the sandy ground. Above, the tangle of weeds did not cover the sky. The black circle of ravens still rotated above. He flicked his eyes to the woman and then up again, watching the one bird as one bird broke from the loop. It spiraled, a floating body of black. The bird extended its wings out wide, capturing the wind, and then darted downward, landing beside the woman's struggling body. The bird lowered its triangular beak to the woman's gray hair and then raised its head, cawing loudly, almost if it was beckoning her to get up. Jake turned and threw himself against the wall, desperately shoving his arms into morphing branches. The wall bit at him but did not part to offer an escape. A long sigh and then more words rose, pressing into his back as language never should. Jake crumbled, defeated, letting his eyes fall upon the incredible sight of the bird and the woman. I think I'll stop there because my dog is snoring now. Thank you, Basha.
Oh, thank you so much for that reading. It's a good stopping point. I did hear
Basha snoring. I put my dog to
bed.
bed.
I did hear the sound. I thought it was an electronic sound.
No.
Manuel, if you can, I'm having trouble unmuting you. It says your mic isn't connected. So if you could connect your mic, I'll be able to get you back into the program. Okay, I think you're back. So again, thank you so much. That was Brenda Tolian reading from Blood Mountain. And before we're nearing the end of the program, but I just have a couple of things I want to do, some shout outs and say goodbye before we go. So if Manuel and Brenda will stay, once we end the program, if you two will stay connected. A couple of ways, a couple of shout outs before we go. If you'd like to stay connected with me, my most recent story has come out in John Paget and Grimscribe Press's Visterian magazine. It's a short story that's out now in that magazine, so that you can get that from Grimscribe. If there are any New Yorkers, here, I will be reading on July 20th. That will be in person at the KGB bar at Ellen Datlow and Matthew Kressel's fantastic fiction reading series. I think there is a way to connect with it after the fact on the podcast. And on July, please come back to Nighttime Logic on July 21st. We'll have Robert Levy and Rudy Dorneman as my guests, and that's going to be another great night. Both those authors have a pair of short stories out in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and we're going to hear from those two stories, and we're going to talk to them. I want to thank everyone tonight. I want to thank Manuel and Brenda for their time and for their fantastic readings. We'll end the night by holding up their books, and both of them can tell you where you can connect with them and their work. I want to thank everyone for coming. A couple of shout outs. I think he's still connected. A friend of the show and a friend of authors is the artist Matt Henshaw, together with Matt Fitzsimmons. Here's a zine that's on my radar, Old Wyeth Scopes. So you can connect with Matt Henshaw and Matt Fitzsimmons and their project. I want to thank everyone for all the different ways that you support us. I always leave these events feeling a lot more inspired than when I came in. So thank you again to Manuel and Brenda for the readings and the conversation. Thank you to our listeners in the comments for supporting the series. If you want to support the series, the best way is to pick up a book. So Manuel, if you can tell us what's the best way that someone who wants to get their own copy of the Book of Shadows, what's the best way they can get that?
Well, you can get it on Amazon, Or you can go directly to the source and get it from jackanapespress.com.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, Amazon and jackanapespress.com for the
Mm-hmm.
Book of Shadows. Brenda, what's the best way someone can pick up their very own copy of Blood Mountain, which is out now?
Just go straight to Raw Dog Screaming Press. I know it's out there in other places, but that's the best way to get a hold of that. And then we were talking about Consume too, and that is on Amazon, and that's or you can go straight to Denver Horror Collective and get that book there, and that is so many talented writers are in that book,
All
and
right.
I highly recommend both of the books. Please buy them both.
Yeah. So okay. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again to Manuel and Brenda. So we
Thank you
will
for having me.
see you next time on July 21st. So please stay cool out there, and as always, stay safe, stay inspired, and I hope to see you all again. Bye for now.
Bye bye.